Hello and welcome to Alaska's Political Pipeline. I'm political reporter Will Courtney. On Tuesday, House lawmakers in the Tribal Affairs Committee and the Committee and Regional Affairs Committee took on the issue of the impacts of former Typhoon Halong. It was a 2-hour meeting, which covered a lot of ground. Some of the big takeaways I heard from the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management Director Brian Fisher. He says he thinks it's unlikely residents will be able to return to their homes by summer. During breakup, what he calls a significant cleanup operation will begin, focusing on both the infrastructure of the villages of Kipnuk and Kwigillingok. If you don't remember, those were two of the hardest hit villages from former Typhoon Halong, with also a focus on the environmental damage from the typhoon. Relocation was not a main focus, but Director Fisher said it wasn't in the division's scope to get into that conversation either. Village leaders from both Kipnuk and Quig have explored these ideas, but it could take millions of dollars and over a decade to relocate. We'll start today's show with how the meeting ended, with the emotional testimony from Tuksuk Bay Representative Nellie Jimmy, describing that night and what came after it.
I didn't know about the storm. I wasn't tracking it until my daughter said, they're declaring this a really bad storm. And I was like, well, I'll just stay. And my daughter kept egging me on to leave Tuksuk, and she wouldn't stop, and planes were flying even as the winds were picking up, and I just kept saying no. Not long after the evening came, so it was my daughter, my niece up there at my place, and not long after the wind started picking up, and all you could do was just sit and hunker down and watch water rise up, and can't do anything. I know men were struggling and running down to the beach to try, even as if we did prepare, they still had to run down to the beach to pull up their boats even further up because the water was rising pretty quickly. And men were also being affected by almost being hit with debris. And for the first time, we didn't sleep the whole night, and this was the first time I've ever felt so helpless where I knew I couldn't protect my own daughter and my family. Excuse me. So we waited out the storm, that's all we could do, and just by chance, my daughter, she came upon TikTok where people were posting live from Kip about their water coming in quickly and their homes were floating away. And people trapped in their houses, and even though they called for help, they couldn't get help. So it was a pretty hard time. It's another thing to go to the community and see where relatives' homes are destroyed. Where they had to leave everything behind and just bring a backpack. How do you leave? How do you leave the looks that were passed down to you from your grandmother or your ancestors? How do you leave family pictures? How do you just leave everything and just carry what you can? But my people had to do that. And just coming into Anchorage, I wanted to go to the shelters and visit with my people. And I've never seen anybody, humanity taken away from them, as they described being in a floating house, looking out the window and seeing their own loved ones in their coffins pass by their house. Were homes where they were floating away, to be hitting each other as if they were bumper cars, to where they didn't know if their children were safe in another house because they separated, because nobody expected the storm to be this bad, where this parent had let her children sleep at her mom's house, and they're just right next door, only for their house to be, for them to be drifted away. There's just so much that happened. Returning to being able to have eyes on the ground at Kipnuk and Kwigillingok just the smell was different. It didn't smell like our area. It was gone. One of our tribal administrations from Night New, Chris George, said they went to bed in the storm, and they're pretty inland, and you can only access it by river. He said they went home, they survived the storm, which usually there's tundra in the front, and they woke up to the ocean in front of them. That's how high the water came in. I know it's going to be a long recovery, and I know the trauma that we have suffered out there. But how do you leave a village where your ancestors came from, where grandmothers, grandfathers passed down the knowledge of where to hunt, when to hunt, how to process the subsistence catch? There's just so much loss. I just hope we get as much assistance as we can to rebuild. And thank you all for bringing up such great questions and showing your support. I don't know. I just want to close out by thanking Commissioner of DMVA, Major General Torrance Sachs, Director Brian Fisher, Mayor LaFrance in Anchorage, and the municipality, who just opened their arms to my people, and all the communities that took in our own, and all the entities that stepped forward.
After the meeting, I got the chance to ask a few lawmakers their impressions of what they thought of the hearing on Tuesday and what they expect to see from this effort going forward. We start with Fairbanks Democrat Representative Maxine Dibert, and will be followed by another Fairbanks Democrat, Ashley Carrick. Finally, we'll end with non-affiliated Anchorage Representative Kai Holland. All right, so Representative, quite a long meeting today, powerful meeting, especially near the end. Tell me a little bit about your takeaways.
Yes, when you get through all the questions in a heavy meeting, such as going over problem-solving Typhoon Halong, I feel pretty good about that. In hearing our questions, and then I'm so glad that Representative Jimmy was able to come up to the dais and share her story. I recently had a conversation with an elder from my community where we were talking about disasters, floods, fires in the interior, and this elder told me, we always have to be prepared. We have to be prepared at any given time for anything to happen, especially during the spring up in the interior where we have when the ice breaks out, there could be sudden floods. And I think my big takeaway from this committee, and as legislators in our committee, problem solving on how we could be prepared. Learn from this, learn from Murbach. They happen very closely together. So I feel like we're going to have more incidents like this, and to take from what our discussion today and being prepared for the next possible disaster. I hope there isn't one. We could be hopeful, but that's one takeaway we could.
Yeah, and Director Fisher was talking a lot about the efforts going on right now, some of that being rebuilding these homes and making them survivable. I believe that was the word you used for future events like this, exactly what you were mentioning. There has been discussions in these communities about relocation, though. And that wasn't very hit on during this meeting. I'm curious where that kind of ranks in your priorities as a legislator right now.
Absolutely. When we talk about moving communities, I think about my own family. I'm Koyukon Athabascan, and my family grew up in a community on the Yukon River, and we are tied to this place. We're tied to the animals, the subsistence in that area. Like what Representative Jimmy said, these places are special to us. It's what we know. It's in our bones and sinew. And when that's our home, it'd be like moving a big city, you know, and so I'm against that. So I think we need to keep our communities and do whatever we can to get these folks back to where their grandparents lived, their great-grandparents lived, and all of their traditions that they know, their culture.
I mean, these are decisions being made by village leaders, though. So if they're saying that they think they need to live elsewhere, do you think that's something that they should take into account, or do you believe that they should remain on that land, that, you know, they have these schools set up and the post office set up and they're recognized as a village in this specific spot, and obviously it takes a long time to move a village too.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, if there are elders, I always give the floor to the elders in my community. They have a lot, they know a lot, and I definitely would, but I would also like to discuss engineering. Today we talked about the pilings and how that could really help through these future disasters. The pilings for our boardwalks and our homes could help us stay in the places that we know.
Yeah.
And I would also like to add that how important our schools are. And when we talk about disasters in Alaska, making sure, I think Rep. Himshoot brought it up, our boilers work, our schools are well heated, and we have good roofs, not only for our youth every day to learn in, but also for instances like this.
Yeah. And then one last question. Representative Carrick brought up the question of legislative priorities. Short-term, long-term, what's top of mind for you when it comes to this topic?
I would say long-term, it would be the preparedness. And I would like to I think back to Rep. Holland's question, what are we learning from this, A, B, and C, so that we know what to do when the next event like this happens. So I lean towards the preparedness, just what the elders said in my community. We always have to be prepared, and that's very important for our resiliency, so we could stay in our communities.
Absolutely. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your time. Absolutely.
Yeah, Will.
Yes,
yeah.
Will, yes.
I was so confused.
Representative, you mentioned short-term, long-term goals. Do you have any short-term, long-term goals for this project?
Yeah, so I would say in the short term, just like Director mentioned, it's essential to approve the disaster relief funding for Typhoon Halong recovery for Western Alaska. And I think it's also essential to recognize that this happened in Western Alaska, but the next disaster that the state faces could happen anywhere in the state. And we have to start building a lot more resilience into our budgeting, and we have to think more long-term about disaster preparedness in general.
And then relocation was briefly brought up. It wasn't a focus of today. I'm curious where relocation kind of ranks on your list of priorities when it comes to this relief effort.
Yeah, relocation is a huge part of just resilience for communities in general, and I would say it may end up being the best way forward for these communities that have been affected, but just in general, Northwest Arctic and Southwest Alaska are facing a lot of relocation efforts as it is, and we should take those efforts really seriously.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your time. Representative Hall, any takeaways from the meeting today?
I think two things came away. One is it was really valuable discussion for us to come together to understand more completely the work that's been going on for both the initial response and the ongoing work that's happening. The other takeaway, though, is the importance that we need to be investing in the preparation and the conversations and planning that need to happen. I'm particularly concerned about how we think about this as probably an ongoing fundamental change to the exposure of our communities. And while on one hand we've had a incredible level of effort put into the response and recovery from Merbach and now Halong, I think we need to consider what does it look like that we will perhaps see this, every year or two, and the accumulated impact of time and energy and money, I think deserves a new level of attention and a new approach to how we support the investment in community preparation and hardening, so that rather than simply being prepared to spend as much as it takes to help an individual community recover, we have to look harder at what are we doing to help those communities be able to withstand the future storm. We know that in terms of climate adaptation, that there's different numbers, but generally a 6-to-1 return. A dollar into preparation and resilience is saving $6 in the future, and we're going to have to, in a very tight fiscal environment, figure out how do we find the money to put into avoiding the larger cost later in that work. And I'm particularly concerned, and there's efforts in other parts of the world that are looking specifically at how does climate change as it relates to sea level rise impact all this planning, because to the degree that we look at this as a 100-year-ish type of event under static conditions, we are no longer in static conditions. Hawaii has just in the last couple of years had to update their long-term coastal planning from assuming a 3-foot sea level rise by 2100 to now a 4-foot level rise, essentially a 30% increase. And that's completely changing their analysis of where should they build, what should they do to harden the communities. And I think we need to look at that same question of, are we building and are we investing for 2100 as opposed to just simply investing for next year?
And you mentioned Anchorage in one of your questions as well. I think you specifically asked, was Anchorage ready for this event? I'm curious, in your own eyes, do you think Anchorage was ready for this event to take on all these different village residents who've never seen a society like Anchorage is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was super impressed with how Anchorage was ready to respond to this. I think the amount of preparation that Anchorage has done through our Office of Emergency Management and their disaster preparedness really showed off that we were already doing work to prepare for our own mass event in Anchorage, whether it was a wildfire event, another earthquake. And I think it was really beneficial that we saw that preparation really paid off, because the capacity was immediately able to be deployed unexpectedly to a remote community coming in, but that same planning was already there, and people were able to so quickly be able to turn on those plans. I was impressed by Anchorage's preparation, because I know that was preparation that was probably originally intended for Anchorage residents, but they were able to pivot immediately to support others that came into our community.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your
You
time.
bet.
You
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Alaska's Political Pipeline. If you like what you listen to, consider rating our podcast and giving us a follow. We'll be back in your feeds next Monday. But until then, please, take care.